Imagine I show you a photograph from your childhood. You look at it, smile, and remember that day with perfect clarity. Now, imagine I tell you that the photo never existed, that the memory you hold so dear is a complete fabrication. Impossible, you'd say. I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. But here's the problem. History works exactly like that. For centuries, humanity has constructed a version of the past that never happened. Not by mistake, not out of ignorance, but because we needed it to be that way. Today you're going to discover that some of the most iconic images in history, the ones that appear in museums, in books, in movies, never existed. And the most disturbing thing isn't that they're fake. It's discovering why someone needed us to believe them. Stay put. We're about to begin. Part 1. What you thought you saw. Let's start with something visual, something you've probably seen in a museum or documentary. The Iron Maiden. A metal sarcophagus the exact size of a human body, lined inside with sharp spikes. The victim was locked inside, and when the doors closed, the spikes slowly pierced their arms, legs, abdomen, chest, and eyes. They say the victims took days to die, screaming from within until they finally fell silent. It's a brutal, terrifying, medieval image. There's just one problem. It never existed. There isn't a single historical record of the Iron Maiden before the 18th century. Zero. The first account appears when a fellow named Johann Philipp Siebenkees writes about an alleged case in Nuremberg in 1515. He describes in graphic detail how the spikes pierced the man, how he screamed for 2 whole days before dying. The story is visceral, perfect, memorable. It's also completely made up. But it worked, because soon after, Iron Maidens began appearing in museums all over Europe. Not as replicas, but as authentic medieval artifacts. Curators filled their galleries with instruments of torture that never tortured anyone. Why? This is where things get interesting. The 19th century needed a brutal past. Europe was entering the age of reason, science, and enlightened progress. And to feel superior, to justify its supposedly advanced civilization, it needed a contrast. It needed a dark, savage, sadistic Middle Ages. A past from which it had evolved. It didn't matter if that past was real. What mattered was that it fit the narrative. Museums weren't preserving history. They were manufacturing propaganda. And the Iron Maiden is not alone. The pear of anguish, that instrument supposedly inserted into the mouth or other parts of the body, and then expanded to mutilate the victim. There is not a single first-hand account of its use. We found some objects that might have served a similar purpose around the year 1600, based on the style of the metalwork, but the truth is, we don't know. And that ambiguity is narratively pure gold, because it reveals something uncomfortable. Much of what we know about medieval torture comes from museums that filled historical gaps with invented objects, because the public wanted horror, it wanted blood, it wanted confirmation that the past was worse than the present. 19th century illustrators drew scenes of torture based on their imaginations. Victorian fairs displayed replicas of instruments that never existed. And slowly, then those images became history. Because if something looks historical, if it's in a museum, if you've seen it in a book, then it must be true. But here's the lesson. The history you remember isn't the history that happened. It's the history someone needed you to remember. Part 2. The heroes that never were. If objects lie, heroes lie even more. Because history isn't about real people. It's about the stories we tell about real people. And those stories change depending on what we need to believe at any given moment. Let's take the most massive case of all. The pyramids of Egypt. For centuries, the narrative was simple and brutal. Tens of thousands of slaves whipped under the relentless desert sun, dragging stone blocks to their deaths to satisfy the megalomania of a pharaoh god. It's a powerful image. It fits perfectly with our idea of ancient civilizations. Absolute power, extreme suffering, total oppression. There's a problem. It's not true. Modern historians agreed that the pyramids were not built by slaves at all, but by seasonal workers brought from their homelands when the Nile flooded and the fields became unusable. These workers lived in villages built specifically for them, ate quality food, and received medical care. In some cases, they lived better than on their own farms. The pyramids were the most important engineering projects of their civilization, are intended to be the tombs of pharaohs considered living gods. It makes sense that their construction was overseen by expert architects and carried out by professionals, not by chained and desperate people. So, why do we insist on the slave narrative? Because it fits with our understanding of power. For centuries we've been told that great projects can only be achieved through extreme suffering, that greatness requires forced sacrifice. When you discover that one of the wonders of the ancient world was built without mass slavery, you're not just correcting a fact. You're shattering a deeply ingrained belief about how societies, labor, and human progress function, and that makes people uncomfortable. Let's talk about Lady Godiva. The story is perfect. Her cruel husband, Leofric, has just raised taxes in the city of Coventry. The people are already poor, and both they and Lady Godiva consider the new taxes excessive. She begs her husband to lower them. He agrees, but only if she rides naked through the city, assuming she would never do it. To his surprise, Godiva agrees. She rides out on horseback, covered only by her long hair. The townspeople, out of respect for her modesty, avoid looking at her, all except a tailor named Tom, who spies on her, hence the expression, peeping Tom. Tom is punished by going blind, either by the townspeople or, in some versions, by God himself. It's a beautiful story. It speaks of sacrifice, shame, social control, and female rebellion within patriarchal boundaries. There's just one detail. Lady Godiva was a real person. Coventry is a real city, but this legend is almost certainly false. Why? First, because it's absurd. Second, because the first written version of this story appears in the 13th century, almost 200 years after Godiva's death. No one who knew her ever mentioned this event. So, where did it come from? That it was probably a moral fable created to teach obedience, modesty, and the consequences of defying the established order. It originated as propaganda, not as history, but it survives because it's memorable, because it fits with archetypes we recognize, because it satisfies something within us. Myths don't need to be true. They only need to be useful. And now Salem. The classic image. Women accused of witchcraft, tied to stakes, burned alive while a crowd watches. Except that never happened. And in the Salem witch trials, no one was burned, not a single person. What actually happened was this. 200 people accused, 30 found guilty, 19 hanged, 15 died in prison, and one man tortured in a way far more interesting than any pyre. His name was Giles Corey, a farmer from Salem who, even before being accused of witchcraft, already had a criminal record worthy of a TV series. One Tuesday, he'd go out into the fields and beat one of his employees to death for stealing apples. The next Friday, he'd be accused of setting fire to his neighbor's house. In 1692, Corey's wife was accused of witchcraft and arrested. At first, Corey agreed. It makes sense, he thought. Until a month later, he was arrested on the same charge. That's when he changed his mind. This is ridiculous, he said. Someone had accused him of appearing to them like a ghostly figure and repeatedly striking them. Corey neither pleaded guilty nor innocent, because if he made a plea, the court could legally confiscate his lands and properties instead of them being inherited by his family. So he simply said nothing, not even when the sheriff tortured him by placing him between two boards and piling rocks on top of him. For 3 days, the sheriff asked, "Ready to confess?" And Corey replied, "More wait," until he finally died, never revealing whether or not he was a witch doctor. Corey's story isn't a macabre oddity. It's something far more disturbing. And Salem wasn't medieval madness. It was a rational legal system enforcing unjust laws. People didn't die because society was ignorant. They died because the system functioned exactly as designed. That idea is far more unsettling than any imagined bonfire. Part 3. The sacrifices that make us feel good. And now we come to the greatest myth of all. Thermopylae. 300 Spartan warriors holding off a Persian army of over 100,000 men. An impossible battle. A perfect sacrifice. The last stand of men trained from childhood for war, born into a society that threw weak infants off cliffs to create an elite race. It's epic, it's inspiring, it's also false. Here's the reality, which is frankly much more interesting. In 480 BC, Emperor Xerxes decided to destroy Athens after they supported a rebellion against his Persian Empire. His father, Darius, had tried before and failed. Xerxes wasn't about to make the same mistake. Then he assembled an army of over 100,000 soldiers and began his march on the city. When Athens found out, they joined forces with other Greek city-states under the leadership of King Leonidas of Sparta. Together, they formed an army of 300 Spartans, as well as 7,000 soldiers from Thespian, Athenian, Theban, and Phocian forces. Over 7,000 men, not 300. Before the battle, they consulted the Oracle of Delphi to see the future. The Oracle foretold 2 possible outcomes. Either Sparta as a civilization would be destroyed, or a Spartan king would die in battle. Despite this prophecy, King Leonidas did not hesitate. He was fully prepared to give his life for his people. The Greeks chose to make their stand at Thermopylae, at a narrow pass called the Hot Gates. When Xerxes arrived with his army, the Spartans formed a wall with their shields and thrust their long spears into the approaching Persians. They killed wave after wave as the Persian bodies piled up higher and higher. The battle raged on for days until the Persians discovered a narrow path through the mountains. After a long march in single file, this path allowed them to completely outflank the Greek forces. Leonidas had learned of this path and left an army of 2,000 Phocaeans to guard its entrance. But when the Persians finally arrived on the third day of battle, the Phocaeans were no match. Xerxes' army completely surrounded Leonidas, and the Spartan king ordered the allied Greek forces to retreat and live to fight another day. He planned to remain with his 300 elite Spartan warriors and fight to the death to fulfill the oracle's prophecy. If Sparta was to survive, its king had to die in this battle. Many soldiers, overcome with emotion, decided to stay and die by the king's side. In the violent battle that followed, and the Greek army surged through the pass to confront the Persians directly, aiming to kill as many as possible. They fought until their shields and spears were shattered, then switched to short swords, and when those inevitably wore down, they used their bare hands and teeth. The result was that the Persians breached the gates of Thermopylae and were able to lay siege to Greece. But the fighting had cost them some 20,000 soldiers, while the Greeks had lost only a couple of thousand men and a king. Leonidas died in the battle, struck down by a hail of arrows, fulfilling the oracle's prophecy. So, where is the lie? In what we do with this story. For centuries, Thermopylae has been used to justify national sacrifices, impossible wars, and speeches about dying for one's country. The myth of the 300 doesn't survive because it's accurate. It survives because it's useful, because it transforms a tactical military defeat into an absolute moral victory. Then because it allows us to believe that pure sacrifice, heroic death, the last man defending the gate, means something greater than the mere loss of lives. And those babies thrown from cliffs in Sparta, that brutal society that created perfect warriors by eliminating the weak, that's a myth too. There's no solid historical evidence that this was a systematic practice. But we need to believe it was, because if the Spartans were so brutal from birth, and then their sacrifice at Thermopylae becomes even more epic. They weren't just men. They were war machines created by artificial selection. Myth amplifies myth, which brings us to the most uncomfortable truth of all. Historical myths aren't born to explain the past. They're born to justify the present. The 19th century needed a brutal Middle Ages to feel civilized. Modern nations need self-sacrificing heroes to give meaning to their wars. And societies need clear villains and pure victims to avoid confronting the moral complexity of reality. And we all need to believe there's a clear difference between the dark past and our enlightened present. But that difference doesn't exist. Not because the past was better than we think, but because the present isn't as different as we want to believe. We keep fabricating narratives that fit what we need to feel. We keep simplifying history to sell it. We keep confusing emotional truth with historical truth. History doesn't lie. The stories we tell about it do. Every object in a museum, every hero in a book, every battle in a movie carries the marks of who told it, when they told it, and why they needed to tell it that way. The Iron Maiden never tortured anyone, but her existence as a myth tells us everything about the 19th century. The pyramids weren't built by slaves, but our insistence on believing it reveals more about us than about Egypt. Thermopylae wasn't a battle of 300 men, but the fact that we continue to tell it that way shows what kind of stories we need to feel good about sacrifice and war. So, here's the final question, the one that will linger. If so many things we believe about the past are false, how many of the things we believe today will end up being myths tomorrow? If this video made you question something you thought you knew, like and subscribe for more stories that shatter what you thought was real.